Okay, first of all, awesome. All right, I gotta stop resisting my urge to mess with that mic. My name is Katie Clune. I'm director of the Virginia Folklife Program, which is part of Virginia Humanities, your state humanities council. That also is, of course, the presenter of the Virginia Festival of the Book. And I'm so happy to welcome all of you here this afternoon. Thank you for being here. And also thank you to the book festival sponsors and to staff and volunteers, including my colleagues in the back of the room, whose work makes it possible for all of us to be here today. I also want you all to know that today is Festival Friday on the downtown mall. So that means that there are not only more speaker events like this, but also fun creative arts events in the different bookstores and other creative spaces on the downtown mall. So wander around, check it out, and who knows what you might encounter. And I also understand that there are still tickets for the 30th anniversary party tomorrow night, Brody 30, so if that tempts you, please check it out. So before we begin our conversation with authors Pauline Caldas and Lauren Bradstein, just two more brief notes. First, please make sure that your phones are on silent or even turn them off so we can be present and listen together in this space. I also want to take a moment to root us in place. We're here in Charlottesville, in the unceded lands of the Monica Nation, and also across the street from the historic Black neighborhood Vinegar Hill, raised in the name of urban renewal. I share this not as simple platitudes, but because calling up a history of people being forced to forever leave their home is relevant to both of these novels. These works address the impossible choice of leaving home, loved ones for an unknown future, and consider all that is lost when you do. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the authors. After introductions, I'll ask Pauline to start us off by introducing her work, The Measure of Distance, to read a little bit, and then we'll ask an introductory question to just Pauline, and then I'll turn it over to Lauren for the same introduction. Before opening it up to some shared questions, I'll ask the two authors, and then with about 20 minutes left, they're yours. All right, so Pauline Caldas, am I saying your last name correctly? Is the author of The Measure of Distance, Looking Both Ways, The Time Between Places, Letters from Cairo, Egyptian Compass, and the textbook Writing the Multicultural Experience. She also co-edited Dinarzad's Children, an anthology of contemporary Arab American fiction, and Beyond Memory, an anthology of contemporary Arab American creative nonfiction. She was awarded a fellowship in fiction from the Virginia Commission for the Arts, and has been in residency at McDowell, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Writers' Colony at Derry Hollow, and Green Olive Arts in Morocco. She is professor of English and creative writing at Hollins University. Pauline was born in Egypt and immigrated to the U.S. at the age of 8 with her parents. She's returned to Egypt several times, including a period of 3 years when she taught at the American University in Cairo. We are also joined by Lauren Bradstein. Correct emphasis? Great, awesome. I didn't check before we started. Author of 5 novels, including the New York Times bestseller, A Friend of the Family, and the Washington Post Book of the Year, The Explanation for Everything. Her latest novel, We Must Not Think of Ourselves, was selected as a Today Show Read with Jenna book for December 2023. Congratulations, that was just not that long ago. Yeah. And was it was a People Magazine Book of the Week and one of Kirkus's Best Book of the Year. The New York Times called it a, quote, tender, heartbreaking novel that grapples with timeless questions. Lauren's work has been translated into French, Turkish, German, Hebrew, and other languages, and her essays and reviews have been widely published. She's a native of Brooklyn and directs the MFA program at Rutgers Camden and lives in New Jersey with her husband and children. Thank you so much for traveling to be here with us today. So Pauline, I'd like to start by asking you to read us a selection. And introduce the book too, of course.
Can everyone hear me?
No.
Okay, how about now?
It just takes 2 minutes to wake up. Now I'll try.
Hello?
real close. It's on. Just stay real close to it.
How about now? Yes? Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon and taking time to come to our panel. I'm going to begin by just telling you a little bit about the novel, The Measure of Distance. This is a multi-generational immigrant novel, and I started off thinking it would be 2 generations. It ended up being 4 generations. Sometimes you just have to go back in time to be able to understand the present moment. And so it begins actually in the late 1800s and goes up to 2011 when the Egyptian Revolution begins. And it covers a very large extended family, and each chapter focuses on 1 or 2 people who decide to come to the United States. So the scene I'm going to read you takes place between Farid and his son. And Farid goes to the United States in the 1960s to get a master's in engineering, and he makes a very purposeful decision to return to Egypt and to build his life in Egypt and build a family there. It is now 2011, and his son Fethi is an adult, and he has been hearing things about the revolution. He's been put on sort of some online Facebook groups and been asked to join in as this revolution is being planned. And the scene takes place right after a church bombing that has occurred in Alexandria, Egypt. And this bombing actually did take place. A lot of really the historical events that ground this novel, and each of the people who decides to come to the United States, there is a historical event that somehow pushes them or is in some way related to the decision to do so. So in this case, it is this bombing. On January 1st, 2011, a bomb explodes at the El Quddusin Church in Alexandria. It strikes the church around midnight while parishioners are celebrating the new year in worship. The explosion is set off by a suicide bomber outside the church. 21 people are killed and at least 70 are injured. The crashing sound erupts in the church toward the end of the liturgy as the priest intones the final prayer. The ground shakes and pushes everyone back. There is a chaos of movement, and people struggle to leave until they find themselves outside within a crowd of wails and screams. Everyone is bewildered, as if floating above the world, the screams still sounding in their ears. That New Year's Eve, Fethi stayed alone in his Heliopolis apartment, drifting from wakefulness to sleep while the television hummed in the background. A little after midnight, the raised voices coming from the screen brought him to full waking. The erratic shouts and scrambling feet and blasting caught his attention, although the screen only showed smoke in the midst of broken pews. Early in the morning, he caught a taxi and made his way to Mohandasin. The rest of the family had spent the night at his parents' home, celebrating the new year. They woke together to find the news that had already reverberated through the Coptic community, striking new fear. It unsteadied all of them, their sense of security shattered. Fethi's mother ran to ring her sister who lived in Alexandria, and the family stood around her, holding in their breath, ready to catch her should she fall. When the ringing finally stopped and their aunt's voice entered the phone from the other end, a collective release escaped. Fethi walked away from the circle surrounding his mother's phone conversation. "This country will kill us all," he mumbled under his breath. But his father caught his words and threw them back. "These things happen in every country. Look at America, with people who shoot children in schools." Fethi turned to face his father, who was now sitting in his chair. His father's belief in his country boiled under Fethi's skin and gave rise to his voice. He knew that his father still believed Egypt was the mother of the world, el Dunya, as everyone said. His father had grown up in the lap of a country infused with the cosmopolitan air of Jews, Greeks, Muslims, and Christians living alongside each other, exchanging the fruits of their labor. Fethi looked at the man who had raised him, who had outlined his life even before his birth, and released his voice. "This is not the same country that you were raised in. The government doesn't care about Copts. They will protect us from nothing. All the people in this country are hungry. Even those who have degrees are not making salaries that can satisfy their needs. No one is able to get married because they don't have the money to buy an apartment. You have an apartment. If you don't get married, maybe we should give your apartment to someone who needs it. His father's words spat out across the living room. Fathi's mother and sister stood at the kitchen doorway. His eldest sister opened her mouth, but her mother placed her hand on her shoulder to dissuade her. There's more than one way to live in the world, Fathi said, lowering his tone. You're a fool. When you get older, you'll understand. Each generation is not like the last, Fathi said, releasing steam with his words. You took your life and arranged it as you wanted. Now it's my turn. There's no choice in this world, Farid's voice released itself. There are rules and morals to be followed. There are no morals. Look at our leaders, each more corrupt than the other, and there's still a monarchy. Mubarak has been in power for 30 years, and his son will come after him. They are holding the country in their fist and crushing all of us. The smart ones always find a way to succeed. Fathi tried to hold the words in, but they escaped. You succeeded through your connections. No one in this country succeeds through merit. You have to go to America for that. There is no gold on the trees in America. You stay and build your country. Can't you see? It's already crumbling. The country was shattered in '67 and nothing has rebuilt it. We're back to tribal wars and cops are just the easiest enemy. You lived during the times of kings and queens. You were named after the last king when everyone wanted to be like the British royalty. That freedom of '52 came to nothing, and every revolution in this country will come to nothing. We eliminated the British and won our freedom. The country is ours now. It has been 60 years, and Fathi stopped him before he ended his sentence. 60 years, and what do we have? Poverty, overpopulation, people with degrees driving taxis, and only a few can reach the taste of meat. I gave you everything. Food to fill your belly, the best education, a job, an apartment. What more do you want? The freedom to choose. I want to make something with my own hands, not be given something on a silver platter. You sit on your chair and think you rule the world, but you're not a king. Farid heaved his body forward in the chair, his arm gesturing to encircle the apartment. I built a home and a family, and now in your hand is an apartment, a car, a job. Fathi looked at his father for a moment, a feeling of pity overcoming him. His father was in his early 70s, and for the first time, Fathi noted the age in his body, the way his back naturally curved into the position of sitting every day. He wanted to say, I'm sorry, but he swallowed the words. Instead, he spewed his anger, hoping for some relief from what he had been carrying. At least in America, the poor can sometimes become rich, and honest work still has some value. At least one's future is not written at their birth. At least a human being can make something. I want to create with my hands, to know that by my own ability I have made something in the world, not this foolery of money exchanging hands, not this waste of a job with nothing to show what I have done. I want to offer sustenance to another being, a chair to sit on, a piece of bread that nourishes. You reject everything I've given you. Emshi, go away, you don't deserve what you have. After his father spouted the words, Fathi folded into himself as if he could no longer keep his hand in his pocket, hiding what he held. I'm leaving, Fathi said, his tone flat. I won the immigration lottery. Fathi had told no one when he received the news. When he opened the letter, he saw a door opening, but it didn't seem possible he could actually walk through it. Yet he had followed instructions, filled out and submitted the necessary documentation. A few weeks ago, he had gone for the interview. He knew that his education, his knowledge of English, his social status, all of which had resulted from what his father had given him, enabled him to be accepted. He had received the final approval only a few days ago. He hesitated, unsure of what to do, balancing on the seesaw between helping to plan for the revolution and preparing his papers for departure. He had slipped the letter in his pocket, thinking perhaps that was the end of it, that he would continue as if it had not happened. But now, as he spoke the words aloud, he knew he had made his decision. For a moment, the world held still. No cars honking their horns, no card sellers shouting the value of their wares, no children in the streets yelling their games. The father glared at the son, and the son kept his gaze steady. Inside the kitchen, 3 people held their breath. "You've won nothing," his father said.
Thank you, Pauline. I remember that passage, and you certainly capture a really powerful confrontation between generations there. I wonder if you could tell us what prompted you to write this book, and also invite, if you would like, to briefly clarify, you mentioned Copt, and would you like to say a few words of that?
I think I've always wanted to write a kind of a large immigrant story. My parents and I immigrated in '69, and many other relatives of ours have immigrated to the United States and to Canada, and I have gone back and forth to Egypt. And for me, it had to be multi-generational and had to be an extended family, because that's the world I grew up in. Even though once we came here, we became a kind of nuclear family, but still very much connected to our family in Egypt. And I think one of the things that particularly inspired me is that because I went back to Egypt as an adult several times, I saw immigration from both perspectives, from the perspective of those who come here. And so many immigrant stories are really about sort of leaving one's homeland, coming to America, and then the experience of living in America. I wanted to write a novel that also included those who chose to stay in their native country, but who were losing people to immigration. So I really wanted that double perspective, and that was one of the biggest motivations for me. And so the novel does go back and forth so that we see also what happens to the family that remains in Egypt, and what that loss of relatives feels like in that space. Egypt is predominantly Muslim. About 85% of the population is Muslim, but 15% of the population is Christian. Most of them are Coptic. My own family is Coptic, and that's the Coptic Orthodox faith, part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Egypt was originally all Coptic until I think it was the 1400s or 1500s when Islam came to Egypt, and at that time, not only was everyone pretty much Coptic, but also the language spoken in Egypt was the Coptic language. And then Arabic came in and became the dominant language. So there is some tension. For some people, there's tension between Muslims and Copts. For others, they may get along well. But as always, whenever you have a kind of a majority population and a minority population, you have certain tensions. And you also have a complicated history that resulted in what the religious divide is like right now in Egypt. Thank you.
All right, Lauren, I'm going to pass it over to you to tell us about your work and then read us a little bit from it.
So, We Must Not Think of Ourselves is set in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is a period, the ghetto of course is a place, and it existed during a period between 1940, a year after the German invasion of Poland, and 1943, April 1943, which was the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. During this time, the Jews of Warsaw and some Jews from outside of Warsaw, but the Jews of Warsaw constituted the second biggest urban Jewish population in the world. The biggest was in New York. And the Jewish population of Poland overall was 3 million people. It was the largest Jewish population in Europe. So these people were taken from their apartments. The Nazi government said that it was for the safety of the others because the Jews carried diseases. And they were taken from their apartments and they were locked into a small area, 400,000 people. They thought, until the gates were actually locked on that November afternoon in 1940, they thought that they'd be able to come in and out of the ghetto, be able to conduct their business, but of course they were not. And from the very first hour after the ghetto was locked, people who tried to leave were shot. So shots began ringing out from 2 p.m. That November day. The Nazis only allowed 250 calories a day. Obviously, you can't live on that. So I've talked to college students about this book, and they're like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, I think it's a Snickers bar. And they're like, okay, clarify, what kind of Snickers bar? I'm like, I don't know. It's like not like the baby kind, and it's, it's not an airport. Anyway, so what that meant, of course, is that people needed to smuggle to survive. So the people who had resources would give those resources to their small children to to go underneath the walls or the gates and come back, trade their parents' goods and come back with bread or carrots, whatever they could get. Why small children? Because they were the ones who could fit. And if they were caught, they were either imprisoned or killed. So my novel is set during this time. It tells the story of a fictionalized English professor. I'm an English professor. I like to sort of, write what you know. I share certain traits with my characters. He's approached on the very first page by a man named Emanuel Ringelblum. My protagonist is fictional, but Emanuel Ringelblum was not. Emanuel Ringelblum was an historian from Eastern Poland who had been educated in Switzerland, and he understood as an historian that what he was witnessing with the establishment of the Warsaw Ghetto was not a moment in the history of Polish Judaism, but probably the moment. And so he assembled 60 that we know of, writers, journalists, artists, rabbis, intellectuals, and he gave them notebooks. And he said, write this all down. I want you to write everything down that you see. You are going to deny the Nazis your story. All we have left is our story. And it is up to us to tell it. And so those 60 or so people spent the next 2 years before the gross action, which was the beginning of the deportations from the ghetto to Treblinka, a death camp, writing everything down. They wrote down, they interviewed each other, they wrote down the syllabi in the underground schools, they recorded the secret religious ceremonies, they recorded the weddings and the births and the deaths. Somehow civic life persisted even among these inhumane conditions. They took down the propaganda posters, and they wrote down the secret cafe menus, and the newspapers, and the theater. There was Shakespeare in the ghetto. They wrote down that they took reviews of the theater. People did studies of starvation, because of course in these circumstances, people were starving, and so studies that would have been unethical in any other time were now just out in the open, and there were lots of scientists and doctors in the ghetto, and they observed what they saw and wrote it down. They buried the first tranche of these documents, a huge trove, in 1942, before the gross action began. They buried the rest in 1943. I'll tell you the rest of the story maybe during our Q&A. Now I'll just read from 1942. I'm sorry that, I loved listening to Pauline, and it was very heavy, and unfortunately this is very heavy too, but I'll make some jokes after maybe when we talk, just to lighten it up. I will admit that as I have collected testimonies for this archive, I have not always understood. Oh, Adam, my protagonist, is a member of the Oneg Shabbat archive. That's established on he joins on the first page. I will admit that as I have collected testimonies from this archive, I've not always understood what the point of the archive was, or I've seen it in the mildest of terms. That the Oneg Shabbat group has been creating a collective portrait of Polish Jews at this peculiar moment in our history, so that when we remember what really happened, inscribing the truth of what we went through, so that liberation wouldn't erase our memories. But now I realize that we are creating a portrait of Polish Jews at the end of our history. Not one peculiar moment, but the very last moment. It is yet another surprise that it has taken me so long to understand that. When this is over, there will be no more of us. Even among the survivors, should there be any survivors, there will be no more of us. Does it matter if I write of our 1,000-year history on this land? If I write of the culture we have created, the literature, the theater, the science, the economies, the mutual aid societies, the customs, the friendships, the discoveries, the paintings, the newspapers, the cemeteries? It will all be gone, ground into the dust. I'm watching it now out my window, being ground to dust under the wheels of the Nazis' trucks. And as I watch, I find myself thinking, of all things, about language. Although it has its roots as a West Germanic language, English has stolen words and spellings and grammatical constructs from so many languages around the world. Pajama from Hindi, alcohol from Arabic. What was once a minor language spoken on a remote island is now the language of the most powerful nation in the world, with a vocabulary to suit bayonet, blockade, bulwark. I love English for this reason, for its mutability, its ability to change and survive. I love it for its forward momentum. I love it for its willingness to compromise and be better for it. And of course I love Polish, the language I started learning as a child, the language in which I conducted the day-to-day business of my happy life. This was the language my father used to speak with me, the language of the country he died for. Polish is the language in which I earned my money and paid my taxes and slept with my wife. But I want to tell you that the first language I ever heard was Yiddish, whispered in endearments from my mother, Bubala, Shefala, my neshama. When we were babies, when we were very young boys, Yiddish was the only language in the world, and it was entirely a language of sweetness and home. My thoughts, rid of any ability to imagine my fellow man, now turn only toward Yiddish as I watch the German trucks crush our streets and our people under their wheels. If I somehow manage to leave this place, I will conduct the rest of my life in English, or in Polish, or in French, or in Hebrew, or even, God forbid, in German. And if I die, my Yiddish will die with me. Will anyone miss it or remember it? Will anyone miss or remember me? 9, 9, 9. And yet, each of my regular students, this is the next chapter, and yet, each of my regular students survived the first gross action. In fact, 6 of them showed up the next day, strangely unmoved by the deportation surrounding them. Their parents had assured them that they weren't going to be affected, and that was that, as they still trusted what their parents told them. Further gross actions would be taking place every day, but right now the Nazis were concentrating on anyone they suspected of political scheming, plus the everyday vagrants and the homeless. And my students, children of the once upon a time elite, guarded by work papers and some sort of civil authority, were cushioned by whatever luck their old life had afforded them, or whatever their families could still do for them. I looked at their wizened faces, Charlotte, Roman, Eli, Jakub, Raphael, Arkady, and felt an almost smothering love for all of them, even if I should have resented them for their blithe privilege. They weren't innocent. They knew what was happening all around them. But they were not insensitive to their fortune, and they were going to use it to learn English, or solidarity, or whatever I could offer. I could offer them only the best of what I had as a teacher and a person. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And now, you knew this was coming, but tell me what prompted you to write this book.
Sure. So in 2019, before the pandemic, my sister took my family, so I have a family of 4, my father and mother, my brother's family of 4, her own family of 4, on a trip to Warsaw to, excuse me, to honor my nephew's bar mitzvah. He didn't want a big party with, drinks and a disco ball. He wanted like a sort of family heritage trip. Our family had, both sides had roots in Warsaw. A lot of them left in 1920, but like so many, I'm sure like members of your own families, nobody wanted to talk about that, right? They left behind what they left behind. They started their new lives. My father's family, especially, they left in 1920s. My grandmother was born here a few years after that. But they did leave a lot of family in Poland, including my grandmother's grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. They were all annihilated in the Holocaust. So that sort of story lived on in my grandmother, who passed on to my father, and now it lives on in, for better or for worse than me. So anyway, we didn't know anything. We should have maybe, but we didn't. So my sister hired some tour guides, and we went with 6 kids, ranging in age. My nephew, my youngest nephew is 1.5. My oldest nephew is 13. My kids were 3 and 10. And so if you can imagine, like going through Poland on a minivan with, that's the joke. But we saw a lot of stuff, and and a lot of it was really heavy. We went to the Schindler factory. We went to the old Jewish neighborhood in Krakow. We went to Auschwitz, of course. And by the end of it, everybody was getting a little, and so 10 of us peeled off to go to the National Soccer Stadium, which was great, but the 4 of us remaining, my parents, my sister, and I, went to a place called the Jewish Historical Institute, which I had never heard of before. And when you walk into this building, written on the wall in Yiddish, Polish, and English is what we've been unable to shout out to the world. And then you walk up and you see a milk can. And the milk can is corroded, kind of, and it turns out that this is one of the 3 milk cans that was buried in 1943 that contained this entire treasure. One of them, another one is in DC at the Holocaust Museum, and the third is still buried somewhere. And then you walk up another set of stairs, and you learn the entire story of the archive. You see actual documents. You see paintings. There's a watercolor, an artist named Gila Sextine, who's really wonderful, painted of her daughter Marguerite, and she said, I just want someone to know my daughter existed, and she was beautiful, and she was talented, and she was 3. And so you walk through all of these papers, which I never heard of this, and I did it, you know what I mean? Like, for my Jews out there, you know, I did it. I went to Hebrew school, I got bar mitzvah, I should have known this story. I didn't know this story. I was shocked that I didn't know the story, and then when I came home, I was sort of shocked that many other people didn't know the story either, and there are reasons for that I now understand that I can explain later, but as we were walking back to meet the soccer folks who were like, you know, ankle deep in pierogies at that point. We'd been in this place for a very long time. I said to my sister, there are 1,000 novels in that room, and she said, well, you should write one. And I said, I will not. First of all, the Holocaust has been written by much, much greater minds than mine. I read Elie Wiesel, I read Primo Levi. You know, what am I going to add to that literature? Secondly, it's not my, you know, I had written 4 novels before that, primarily dealing with the ins and outs of like getting around the Upper West Side. Like this was not my, this is not my world, this was not my vibe, like you know. But then the pandemic started. So I thought about it a lot, actually. When I got home and I read a lot, I ordered some books about the ghetto, Ringelblum's own diary, the sort of masterful work called Who Will Write Our History by Salim Paskow, who's still a professor at Trinity. There was a documentary about it. So I sort of deep dove, but just to satisfy my own curiosity. I still didn't think I could ever write about it. And then when the pandemic started, and there was death everywhere, right? It was a frightening time. And also I was stuck in the house with my children, who I love, but who would not leave me alone. And suddenly I do not want to compare in any way my very, very fortunate pandemic experience to the very, very horror and devastation of the ghetto. Except to say that sometimes all I need to write a novel is like a little beam of light shining through a window, right? So this moment afforded me that beam of light, and I was able to crack open the window, crack it open, and crack it open, until I could just sort of see through it and try. And so during the pandemic, a time when all my other pandemic projects were a complete disaster, I did, I can't knit, it turns out I can't bake. Well, anyway, so I just wrote whenever I could write, whenever I needed some time to just remove myself to another world. I didn't have all the things I used to think I needed to write a novel. I used to think I needed quiet and silence and light and a candle and all that. I don't. It turns out all I need is 2 minutes for everyone to leave me alone, which has turned out to be harder to secure than I wished it had been. And I would write a sentence at a time, or 2 sentences at a time. And before I knew it, I had this book, and I gave it to my agent, and I said, look, I've never done anything like this before. It might be good, it might not be good. And that was not false modesty. I really didn't know. I hadn't given it to any of my usual readers. I have friends who often read my book, but they were busy homeschooling. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to be like, here in the middle of the pandemic is a book about genocide. Like, I'll spare them. And so my agent called me when she started reading and said, you know, this is set in 1940. And I said, I know, I'm sorry. And she said, and it's in Poland. And I said, I know, I'm sorry. She said, no, I think that's good. I think that's good. And then she read it and she said, I think, you know, it's good. Let's give it to your editor and see what happens. And she did, and so and then it came out in November. And you know, it has been a remarkable experience to share this story with so many people. Jenna Bush selected it for the December, she has this big Today Show book club, and for those of you, many of you know, of course, that it's very strange, the book selling process. It's not like selling a car, right? You can't just put a commercial. No one really, I think, has figured out how to turn a book into a hit, but megaphones like Jenna's really, really help. And so not only was it quite exciting for me to just get attention, but also it felt very meaningful to be able to share this particular story, because of course this is a story that people died not knowing whether or not it would ever be told, their story would ever be told. The epigraph to this book reads like this. I would love to live to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and shriek to the world proclaiming the truth, but no, we shall certainly never live to see it, and therefore do I write my last will. May the treasure fall into good hands, may it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world to what happened was played out in the 20th century. We may now die in peace. We fulfilled our mission. May history attest for us. That was written by David Graeber in August 1942 at the beginning of early in the deportations in Warsaw. He was 18 years old. He died not knowing if this would ever be dug up, but it was. And then people besides me, believe me, besides me, written about it and found it, but by handing it to the Today Show, I did have the opportunity to share the story with a really broad audience. And now I share it with you, and you can share it with people, you can tell other people the story. And so what's been really, for me, quite beautiful is knowing that I've been lucky enough to be sort of a link in the chain of telling a story that people died trying to tell. So that feels very unique to me in anything I've ever written before.
I was chatting with Lauren a little bit before the panel, and I do oral history as a method of research in my work as a folklorist, and I had never heard of the Oneg Shabbat, and immediately texted some other friends in the field, and they hadn't heard of it either. So thank you for telling us about a resource that, you know, is not only incredibly poignant and important in its own right, but also, for me, a little bit is a selfish reminder of the importance of putting down testimony of everyday people as it's happening in their words.
Absolutely.
So it's almost 1:40, so I'm gonna just use one of my questions that I had prepared, because I want to make sure that you all have chances to talk with Lauren and Pauline. So I'll start with one that you seem to both like, which is, despite the challenges and tragedy your characters encounter in both of these works, you also effectively bring the reader into moments of comfort and joy. Can you reflect on this decision?
That's a tough question for me. I think I lean towards tragedy, and so I think I have to remember those happy moments and to sort of see where they are and validate them and enhance them. I mean, they are there, and I think one of the ways that they are here in this book is actually through romantic relationships, which I had not realized I had done. But there are several times when couples fall in love with each other, and there's something really beautiful in that. And as I did get one comment that there was a little bit too much despair, and that I should look more carefully at that and give the readers moments of hope. It was actually a very good insight, and made me kind of look at both the moments of despair and the moments of hope and where they existed. And that's when I realized that it was in these relationships between people that there was connection, and that is really what mattered, particularly given that the novel is about disconnection that comes with immigration, that when you have two people who sort of connect to one another, that kind of almost serves as a resistance against this sort of dispersal and fragmentation of family that takes place as a result of the immigrant experience.
And I actually, despite the topic, I think the reason I was even able to write this book in the first place is because I'm a silver lining kind of person, which can be a little perverse, especially in situations like this. But like early in the book, Adam says, so he's a widower, and he says, and that was a bit of luck, because he knows where his wife is buried. And at a time when everyone's being dumped into mass graves, he has a gravestone to go to. And they never were able to have children. And it turns out that too is luck, because he can go to the ghetto and doesn't have to worry about keeping children alive. Which was the preoccupying, motivation of every parent in the ghetto. So I'm a little bit like that. It's like the dog peed on the floor, but at least it didn't poop. So I just kind of bring that sort of weird. I'm not, and it's funny. I'm not even particularly optimistic. I just like to see the good in any situation as best I can, because it gets me through. So I think that personality trait, which I share again with my character, enabled me to write this book and to inhabit him. I don't think I could have written it from any other point of view, because any other point of view would have been too heartbreaking.
All right, I'll ask one more. So we all talk about, and especially as an employee of a humanities council, the power of books, and particularly fiction, to engender understanding and maybe even intimacy and empathy from the reader towards the characters. And your works, put very challenging moments in history in the context of characters' lives. I wonder, has the reception of these works helped you see that kind of sort of ideal hope we have for fiction is indeed possible? Have you been able to open up some bridges of understanding through these works?
I think I can only say I hope so. And I hope through the reading of the book, let me backtrack. I had to learn a lot about America when I came here at the age of 8. I'm still learning. I don't know a lot of cultural references. I still get baffled about musical references, actors' names, historical things. I've learned a great deal, but I think what I realized at a certain point is that part of that is because I had another cultural context. So for me growing up, when you say 1952, that means something to me. That's when the revolution happened in Egypt, and Egypt won its independence from British colonialism. When you say 1967, that was the War of 67. I was 6 years old at the time, and I remember that war, and I remember turning off the lights, and I remember sitting very quietly in the dark and hearing the Israeli planes go overhead. They didn't have the technology that they have now, so we had to darken the city. And so there are certain sort of moments for me when you say Gamal Abdel Nasser, I know who that is. And I think that's why bringing the history here to say, here is a country, here is its history, here are these very significant moments that have transformed not only the nation, but also transformed people's lives. My parents decided to immigrate, and many Egyptians decided to immigrate after the 67 war because there was a sense of hopelessness in the nation. There was a sense that things would never improve after the 67 war. And so that was particularly important for me to document. I write fiction, but I often think of myself as someone who's really interested in documenting history, but also documenting people's lives as it relates to that history. And I think also bringing people to life, if that makes sense. And I do that and I know you had another question about language. I'm gonna sneak it in there. But also through language, the section I read you is very dialogue heavy. And when my Egyptian characters speak to each other, they are speaking to each other in Arabic, and I hear them speaking to each other in Arabic, and then I translate into English. But I translate in as literal a way as I can so you can hear the language, you can hear their voices. One of the things I decided to do with this novel is I wanted to visually indicate when characters were speaking in Arabic. Arabic does not have capital letters, and so I decided not to use any capitalization when people were speaking in Arabic as a way to sort of visually mark that on the page. But what I think what I'm trying to get at is the power of characters' voices to speak to each other and to speak to their experiences is a way of also humanizing the experiences of people across the world and in a different place than where we live.
Yeah, I felt quite moved. Lots of people, I think if you write about a moment like this, just lots of people have written to me or come up to me after events to tell me about their family's Holocaust stories, or the neighbor down the street who had numbers on his arm, or even other people who have suffered. I mean, believe me, this is not the only, as we know all too well, the only moment of true horror and devastation in the world, and people have just told me about other ones. So I found myself doing more listening than I thought I would ever really do on a book tour, but that's been, again, really moving and humbling. The other thing, very briefly, is that, in a moment when there's been a lot of anti-Semitic acts around the world and in the United States, a lot of Jewish people who you know, feel unsettled, even though they do seem to be so deep from the outsider's perspective. Many, certainly not all, but many Jewish people do seem well rooted in their communities. And why should we be feeling like, oh no, now they said this was coming, and now here it is. We better pack up. And which even I, who am medium rational, because as a vibe, like I have thought, like, well, where would we go? Who would hide us? which one of my children looks more Jewish, which is not a thing I ever thought I would think of before. And they put swastikas on paper all over in all the parked cars in our synagogue, and they vandalized my sisters in Seattle. Anyway, but stories like this, I think, so anyway, so to explain to people, like, outside of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, but just here, where I live in New Jersey, why this is so destabilizing and so upsetting is because stories like this live in our bones. People who've had devastation in their family histories never escaped that devastation, and so for Jews born after 1945, the story of the Holocaust never goes away, like, no matter how far in the past it recedes. And so I think that stories like this have helped some of the people who've read it understand, like, why their neighbors are a little bit very on edge at this moment. It's because you can't just relegate this to the past as much as you wish you could.
We always have such a supportive audience at this festival. I love it. So our volunteer Carol is going to be passing out surveys for you to complete during our question and answer session, which I now open to you. Who has a question for Pauline or Lauren? And we have, I think we have a microphone runner too. It might be Carol. But who has a question? Just be loud. All right.
I'm just amazed.
Oh, perfect.
I am just amazed that the courage that it took to document those things, but then to put them in a milk can. I mean, a milk can is not small, and how they were able to do that, to preserve that history. It took so much courage.
Yeah, it's pretty startling, but of course they had nothing, there was no, at that point, what do you have to lose, you know? They
Right.
knew that they were not going to survive, most of them, and most of them didn't. So of the 63 survived, they dug up the treasure in 1946 and again in 1950. I said before I'd explain why no one's really heard of it. It's because it was dug up into communist Poland, right? Warsaw at that point had very strong ties to Moscow, and Soviet ideology said that the only real victims of the Nazi regime were communists, not Jews, so that even though most of the Holocaust did take place in area that the Soviet Union now controlled, or that had close ties to the Soviet Union, they didn't put any energy or resources into memorializing the Holocaust. So this was unearthed into a place that did not necessarily, it's not that it was pressed, but it just didn't get the attention it might have had it been dug up somewhere else. So it is incredible that it was discovered at all, that 3 people survived, that they remembered where to dig is unbelievable, that someone knew to do this in the first place, the whole thing is unbelievable. So, and it's unbelievable that more people don't know.
Yeah, now they will.
Now they hope so, yes.
The other thing is, and then I'll hand it over, I think both of you, to me, have been an inspiration that we all should write down. It wouldn't be like this perhaps, but because we've talked about before some of the family history we don't know and our parents are gone, so we can't, what a gift we would give to our children.
Yes.
So you can do it so easily. You can interview each other and just record it on your iPhone voice memo.
So you
And
both,
email it to your children.
yes, you both have been
No excuses.
No excuses, right.
Any other questions from the audience? I've got others if you're feeling quiet. Here we go. Hold on.
Thank you both for writing your books, putting them down. But I wanted to direct this to Lauren. I wanted to thank you for writing that book. I know apparently it's out of your genre, your normal genre, because even today it is relevant. It continues to be relevant, and I hope more people keep writing these books to keep it in the front of our country's mind. And the world. And I wanted to know, you said in that one room there were many stories. Is there another one?
There is not. I'm never able to write sequels. I've never done it. And I like to sort of let the readers have the characters once I'm done with the book, and I always feel like which is weird because I'll read a sequel, but I always feel like writing a sequel is imposing what I think on a character's trajectory. But when I'm done with the book and I hand it to a reader, I want the reader to take it from there. Because that's what I do with my favorite books. And I don't need no author to tell me what happened to my favorite characters. I know. So, yeah. So unless something strange happens, this is it.
Got one in the back.
I probably don't need a microphone. How did your 10-year-old react to your trip?
Oh, that's a great question. So, and a longer answer. Before we went to the Holocaust Museum in DC, which I thought would be a really good idea to sort of get him ready for the trip, and it turned out it was a terrible idea because actually the museum is far more graphic in most cases than anything you would see. If you don't know what you're looking at, say in Auschwitz, what you see are fields and buildings. You really have to understand the history to bring the horror. There are some displays that show the glasses and the shoes and the hair, but you don't have to go into those buildings. And so even we went into a gas chamber, which just looks like a concrete bunker, unless you know. So as long as I didn't sort of force him to look at things that were too hard for him, that he didn't have to. And there was, believe me when I tell you, lots of bribery involved in keeping the spirits up. But he was with his cousins, who he live in Seattle, who he never gets to see, and there were moments of fun. You know, we went to like the Copernicus Museum. We did other things, but the reason I'm glad you asked that is that the 1,000-year history of Jewish people in Poland is not justified by unfortunately, many of us just think of the Holocaust, but actually, it's a history with so much joy. And so we went to this museum called Poland, which tells the whole story of the Jews in Poland. The idea is that Jews were kicked out of Western Europe, and when they got to the forests of what would become Poland, they called it Poland, which in Hebrew is a place of rest. And they established these communities that were, full of drudgery, and you guys have seen Fiddler on the Roof, right? But but also there was joy. And so, although we did see sites of real tragedy in our trip, we also saw lots of things that were beautiful and fun, and that felt really good. And then we culminated with my nephew's bar mitzvah party in the new JCC in Krakow, which is really bustling and which is really cool, and where they have a daycare and they have Shabbos dinners and you can run around and it's fun. And I think that one of the best things about this trip was that slowly Jewish joy is returning to Poland, and we got to be part of that.
One final question from the audience.
Thanks. I have a question for Pauline. Did you share your story with your family? And if you did, what was their reaction?
The best reaction I got is that my older daughter read the novel, and she said, "It was really good, Mom. I forgot that you wrote it." That's really the moment when I felt I had succeeded, and that even though she might have known, some of that history, and that this was based on that when she read it, she got immersed enough in the novel that she forgot I was the writer. And so far I have not heard from other relatives. I read it to my husband while I was still, when I had the first draft of it. So he got to listen to it and gave me some great feedback. So we'll see. But I do want to say, recording and documenting family history is really important. And it's not about publication, because in a sense, not this novel, but I am working on a sort of a family document that I am intending for it to be only for my family. That's my audience for it. And I think there's something about writing for that very specific audience to say, I want to share with you this family history that belongs to us, and this is only for us, that I think can be really powerful. So we'll see what happens when others read it.
Well, I'm gonna end on a brief question that I think you'll enjoy hearing the answer to. And at the conclusion, Lauren and Pauline will head towards the back where you have the opportunity to have them sign a book. Okay, so you're both creative writing teachers and you teach young people how to express themselves through words. What would be a common piece of advice or counsel you give to writing students or young writers or emerging writers? Doesn't matter what age you are.
It's a great question. There's lots of advice that I give, but I'll pick one. I think have faith in yourself as you are writing, even when you are encountering obstacles, even when you get to that place where you think, this is not working, it's no good, I can't fix it, keep going, like just keep going. Eventually the work will unfold, it will sort of reveal itself. So I think it is a kind of a don't give up thing, but don't give up in the sense of continue to write through the obstacles, write through the difficulties, and just keep going and have faith that the very process of writing is going to sort of unravel and that the work will reveal itself to you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And the only, excuse me, the only thing I would add to that is to read. I just, whatever I can tell you, a great book can probably show you better. And so for me, there's no writing without reading, and for my students, I give them a whole list, but I want them to add to it to find the books that speak to them, to find the books that will hold their hand as they're writing their own. They won't be mine. For as long as they're going to be writing, I hope they're reading for even longer. So I just read.
Any final questions?
We have like 3 minutes.
Squeeze it
No,
in.
really, I can tell you that.
Right it out.
My dog.
All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Let's give them both a big round.